Good evening. We've got a very exciting presentation for you this evening. Dan Lazare is going to tell us all about Carlo Tresca, who, Italian-American, very, very vigorous, very active in the labor movement back in the 1910s. So really looking forward to hear what Dan has to say about Carlo Tresca. Thanks very much, Dan.
My pleasure. So am I on? Everyone can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you, yes.
Great, okay. So between 1870 and 1914, 14 million workers and peasants left Italy for places from America to France, Germany, Switzerland, Argentina, etc. 4 million of them went to the United States, and of those 4 million, one of them was a man named Carlo Tresca. Tresca was born in Sulmona, Italy, the birthplace of the Roman poet Ovid. In 1879, his father was a landowner, but too poor to send him to a university. So as a consequence, Sulmona was an important rail center, and Tresca got involved in the local railroad workers union, editing a socialist newspaper in the Abruzzo called Il Germe, literally the germ, and then was sentenced to prison for his radical activities, but in 1904, essentially abandoned Italy and fled to the US, settling in Philadelphia. Interestingly enough, he had a rendezvous with a young Mussolini in Switzerland when he passed through on his way to, I think it was Hamburg, was the debarkation point. Anyway, he spent an evening with Mussolini, who was then still on the left, and Mussolini criticized Tresca as not being imbued with the proper spirit of revolution. And at the time, Mussolini was still very much a man of the barricades. But once he found his way to North America, Tresca became the secretary of the Italian Socialist Federation, and for 3 years edited the Federation's newspaper, Il Proletario. He adopted anarcho-syndicalism in 1907. He moved to Western Pennsylvania, a major coal mining and steel center, where he edited other Italian newspapers. And finally, in 1912, joined the Industrial Workers of the World, where he took a leading role in massive strikes in Lawrence, Massachusetts, Little Falls, New York, a hotel workers strike in New York City, the Patterson Silk Strike in New Jersey, and a strike by iron miners in the Mesabi Range in northern Minnesota. Tresca was arrested more than 36 times over the course of his career. He was in 1908, he was attacked by a razor-wielding Italian gangster, and his face was seriously slashed. He avoided deportation in the Palmer raids in 1919 to 1920. This is when hundreds of left-wing immigrants were put on boats, either for Europe or the infant Soviet Union. But in 1923, he was railroaded into prison for publishing in Il Martello, a newspaper he had founded a year or two earlier, an ad for a birth control pamphlet. And that drew him a sentence of, I think it was 2 years in federal prison, although in 1925, the feds cut his sentence to 4 months while admitting that the proceedings had originated with a complaint from the fascist government in Italy. So just to sum up, Tresca was an extremely colorful character, but he was more a passionate journalist than he was in any sense an intellectual. Abstract theory, ideological orthodoxy were not his forte. He had an extremely quick and easy rapport with his working class audiences. His biographer, Nunzio Pernicone, an American academic, whose father, by the way, had worked with Tresca years earlier, wrote in his biography that was published in 2010, sorry, that Tresca, quote, demonstrated his unique ability to assimilate into a working class environment, feeling entirely comfortable with rough-hewn Italian miners and mill hands, and relating to them as a friend and comrade rather than a famous leader. Typically, after a long day in the lecture circuit, he would enjoy himself thoroughly when invited by his hosts to share a simple meal of pasta and homemade wine and spend the evening playing cards, smoking, and telling tales. He often found himself sharing a bed, not only with his minor host, but also with the host's children. Let me just add that these were tumultuous, absolutely tumultuous years in American labor history. American labor relations were the most violent anywhere in the industrial world, with the exception of Tsarist Russia. There was complete lawlessness. The federal government had very little control. And in fact, private strike-breaking agencies had more men under arms than the entire US Army at that point. There was civil war in the coal fields of Colorado, and I mean real civil war, with gunfights breaking out daily, killings on both sides, and battles with the National Guard, and in one famous and tragic incident in Ludlow, Colorado, strikebreakers opened up with machine guns on a miners' tent camp, killing 38 people, many of them women and children. Tresca wrote in January 1917, that, quote, "The proletariat of America has never been attacked, assaulted, and threatened with such violence and rage by its irreconcilable enemy, capitalism, than at the present moment." So it was not just Russia that was entering into a revolutionary moment, but the United States as well. Tresca added in 1919 that Italian immigrants, quote, "sought only bread that was less hard, work that was less exhausting, and instead they gave us bullets, only bullets and handcuffs, as in Italy. Not royal bullets, but Republican, small r Republican bullets." The only Italians who prospered in America, he said, quote, "were the bankers who steal our savings, the priests who charge dearly for paradise, the newspaper owners who sell us to the bosses for 30 pieces, and all those other species of co-nationals who, with swindles as the means and our blood as the end, ensnare our martyred bodies with 1,000 different tentacles to suck the last drop of our blood." So you can get an idea of what his rhetoric was like. America's entry into the war in 1917. America entered the war in 1917, and of course, the war was concluded in 1918. The post-war period saw massive strikes in the United States. Most famously, a huge steel strike in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, that nonetheless all ended in major defeats. The path was just thus cleared for Calvin Coolidge, the ultra-conservative president of the United States, who was elected in 1924. The Wall Street boom and what I might call the Mussoliniization of the US, where Il Duce was massively popular. The entire political establishment was well disposed to Mussolini, and they regarded Mussolini's enemies in the U.S. as by nature subversive and disloyal, and as hostile to the U.S. as they were to fascist Italy. Tresca's career therefore divides into two parts. There's the period from 1904 to 1919 or thereafter, when he was mainly a journalist, but also an important strike leader. After 1919, with the collapse of the industrial workers of the world and the subsidence of the American strike wave, he founded a newspaper called Il Martello, the Hammer. And beginning in 1921, even before Mussolini's March on Rome, emerged as the chief opponent of Mussolini in the Italian American community. Il Martello became the leading anti-fascist publication, and Tresca himself would write literally hundreds of articles per year. Pernicone says that, quote, literary finesse was not his forte. His writing style exhibited irony, sardonic humor, sarcasm, and raw power, best symbolized by the blunt but effective instrument that adorned Il Martello's masthead. Il Martello reprinted articles by Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman, Enrico Malatesta, Lenin, Trotsky, Karl Liebknecht, Rosa Luxemburg, Eugene V. Debs, John Reed, and many others. Tresca, as an unrepentant anarcho-syndicalist, turned anti-Soviet after Kronstadt. He denounced the regime for suppressing the Kronstadt revolt, was attacked by communists as a turncoat, to which he replied, my ardor still burns, as my ardor for revolution still burns. In fact, it burns all the more when I am obliged to recognize that the Bolshevik government has stolen final victory from the Russian Revolution, suffocating that generous people in the bonds of dictatorship. So Tresca emerged as an opponent, an anarchist opponent of Bolshevism. He kept his distance from the Communist Party, but Pernicone points out that nonetheless he continued to collaborate with the CP in the fight against fascism. In fact, continued to regard the CP, despite all their differences, as a more reliable ally than the old Socialist Party, which by this point was in disarray and was completely collapsing in terms of membership and militants. Tresca took part in the campaign to save Sacco and Vanzetti, two Italian anarchists who were accused of a bank robbery in Massachusetts, and were executed in 1927 following an international protest. And he joined with the communists and calling for a general strike to save Sacco and Vanzetti, but the strike, of course, went nowhere. Tresca even worked very closely with a Communist Party member named Vittorio Vidali, who would later emerge as a leading Stalinist hitman and agent who helped plan the assassination of Trotsky in Mexico City. Mussolini's political police, meanwhile, dubbed Tresca as the deus ex machina of anti-fascism in the United States, suppressed Il Martello in 1923 and called for Tresca's liquidation. The same year, the U.S. government tried to ban Il Martello at the behest of Mussolini, while fascists tried to kill Tresca with a bomb at a rally in an Italian neighborhood in East Harlem, New York, although the bomb exploded prematurely, killing 3 Italian-American black shirts. Tresca went left after the crash. He decried the lack of militancy by American workers, although that aspect would soon change, of course, with the strike wave of 1934. He was violently opposed to Franklin D. Roosevelt, who he lambasted as a would-be savior of capitalism. He remained completely hostile to FDR until 1940, when after war broke out. Tresca threw himself into the fight against Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 to 36. This is when admiration for Mussolini among Italian Americans reached their peak, when it's believed that probably 90% of Italian Americans were pro-fascist at the time. He said that he said, quote, our duty is to do whatever we can to sabotage that war. And he attacked Stalin for essentially maintaining commercial relations with fascist Italy, and refusing to criticize the invasion, lest those relations be disturbed. Tresca wrote, "The international proletariat is with Abyssinia. Will Russia scab against international solidarity?" Tresca threw himself into the Spanish Civil War, in which he opposed the Popular Front government and declared that Spain will only be saved by a revolutionary alliance between anarchist and socialist workers. The May days of Barcelona in 1937, when the Stalinists moved to suppress the anarchists and Pumists, the semi-Trotskyists who belonged to the Partido Obrera, the Unified Marxist Workers' Party. He denounced communist accusations that anarchist leader Camillo Berneri was a counter-revolutionary. He lambasted the Stalinists in Spain, as well as their co-thinkers in New York, who took up the same line, who described the May Days revolt as a Hitlerian revolt, and suggested that Berneri had gotten what he deserved. A short time later, Tresca identified the architect of Berneri's murder as a leading American communist named George Mink, who had emerged in Spain as a leader of the Soviet GPU, the secret police. Tresca also championed the case of a woman named Juliet Stewart Poyntz, that's spelled Poyntz, a CP leader who had joined the GPU, had become disillusioned and returned to the US in 1936, where she had reestablished relations with Tresca, who was her old friend. In June 1937, Poyntz disappeared from her boarding house room in Manhattan, and had apparently been kidnapped by the GPU, put on a boat, and apparently executed. And her likely assassin was a man named Sachno Epstein, a former editor of a communist Yiddish newspaper called the Freiheit, who was her one-time lover, who apparently arranged the kidnapping. And in 1938, Tresca told the New York Times, "The time has come when radicals in the United States who dare to speak against the Stalin regime should take some measures of self-defense against the terrorism of the Soviet GPU. If Miss Poyntz could be kidnapped, taken aboard a Soviet vessel in New York or some other American port, and hustled off to Russia. There is no guarantee that others may not suffer the same fate. Indeed, Trotsky said in 1938, quote, "The Kremlin beast is wounded but not dead. Its last convulsions can be terrible. I believe, for example, that Comrade Tresca is now one of the targets for the hatred and revenge of the GPU." Tresca took part in the famous Dewey Commission, which was formed to investigate the charges that were made in Moscow, the Moscow show trials, that Trotsky was an agent of both the Nazi regime in Berlin and the Japanese militarist regime in Tokyo. He took part in that commission along with the journalist Carlton Beals, who actually left the commission and denounced it, the German Marxist Otto Ruhl, the French writer Alfred Rosmer or Rome, and John Dewey, the philosopher himself. Now, let me just sum up Tresca's career so far. So he goes from being a anarcho-syndicalist, labor leader and journalist who took part in some of the most tumultuous strikes in US labor history, to being a leading anti-fascist journalist, and then an anti-Stalinist journalist, particularly after the events in Spain in 1937 and the Moscow show trials. He was a member, probably people are familiar with the term, the 2.5 International. That was the phrase that that Lenin used to describe certain left-wing socialist dissidents who had split to the left from the Second International, but had not yet joined the Third International. So they occupied a position roughly midway in between the two. By 1936, 37, 38, we saw the appearance of what might be called a 3.5 International. These were people who had broken with the Third International, Stalinism, and many of them had come into a Trotskyist orbit, but they resisted joining Trotsky's Fourth International, and instead hovered somewhere midway between revolutionism and liberalism. In New York, the 3.5 International included a group, an intellectual layer that would come to be known as the New York intellectuals, people like Edmund Wilson, Sidney Hook, Dwight MacDonald, Philip Roth, and William Phillips, editors of a highly influential journal called The Partisan Review. While abroad, comparable figures included George Orwell and Ignazio Salone. And Tresca was also a leading member of this group. Tresca viewed as part of his, in keeping with his anti-Stalinist zeal, Tresca viewed the Soviet Union as state capitalist and therefore fully imperialist, on par with the United States or Nazi Germany. He nonetheless, this is highly confused, but he nonetheless swung around to supporting Franklin Roosevelt when he was up for re-election in 1940. Even though he had previously loathed FDR for FDR's efforts in behalf of capitalism. Tresca wrote, as a matter of fact, even those who foolishly repeat those phrases that there is no difference between Nazism and bourgeois liberalism, even those who foolishly repeat these phrases know in their hearts that there is a difference. As the foremost task of humanity in this tragic hour is to strike fascism and Nazism dead, I who on part of humanity live but day by day, hoping for the most sensational defeat of Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin. Now, this is during the period of the Hitler-Stalin non-aggression pact, and therefore Tresca took up the line that all three were indistinguishable, and that it was time to join forces with the liberal bourgeoisie and combating them. George Orwell essentially followed the same logic. I don't know if people are familiar with the famous essay that George Orwell wrote called "The Lion and the Unicorn," in which he sort of wrestled with his attitude towards the war which had just broken out, and essentially said that he would side with Churchill, despite all his hostility to everything that Churchill stood for. But this is important, which is important for a number of reasons, but one of which has to do with an event that took place in January 1943 in Lower Manhattan in January 1943, January 11th to be precise. Tresca had just come from having dinner with the novelist John Dos Passos in a restaurant on I think 14th Street in Manhattan. He was leaving with another man. They were walking to the subway when out of the darkness, someone crept up behind him and fired 2 shots into the back of his head, killing him instantly. The killer turned out to be a small-time hood named Carmine Galante. But nonetheless, theories immediately broke out as to who was responsible for the killing, whether it was the Mafia, the fascists, and those two groups are often really one and the same, or the Stalinists. Many anti-communists maintained that the Stalinists were the likely party, but I myself, I confess, was inclined to believe that theory as well, but Pernicone fairly demonstrates that it's incorrect for a number of reasons. One of which the GPU would never hire a small-time hood like Galante. Stalin had his hands full in January 1943, while the war in while the Battle of Stalingrad was still raging. Torrio Vitale, the alleged the man who was suspected of being behind the job, had an airtight alibi in that he was in Mexico City at the time. Also, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, tended to believe and wanted to believe that the Communist Party was behind, the Communist International was behind the murder, but Hoover was never able to find any evidence suggesting that was the case. And if Hoover couldn't find any evidence, then I presume there probably was no evidence to be found. So it appears to be a hit by the Mafia, perhaps in collaboration with the fascists. And that theory is borne out that a few months earlier, Tresca had taken part in a dinner at a Manhattan venue called by an anti-fascist Italian-American group. And once he got to the dinner, he was alarmed and outraged to find that the dinner was filled with all kinds of Johnny-come-lately anti-fascists who had supported Mussolini a few months earlier, but changed their tune once war broke out between the U.S. and Italy in order to ingratiate themselves with Washington. So Tresca was very angry, being a very boisterous and somewhat loud and flamboyant individual, started insulting those people around him. And one of the people he ended up insulting was a high-ranking mafioso named Frank Garofalo. And it's believed, and the evidence seems to be fairly conclusive, that Garofalo hired Galante to kill Tresca in January 1943. But the reason, the nature of Tresca's politics and the nature of his newfound alliance with FDR is important here, because the political authorities in the US never carried out a thorough investigation of the murder, and no one, in fact, was ever arrested for the crime. For example, and the reason is that the FDR administration was soft on fascism. For example, the FDR had been friendly towards Mussolini prior, through the invasion of Ethiopia, and had only broken with him after it became clear that Hitler and Mussolini were entering into a joint alliance. And even after the war began, the US Office of War Information adopted Winston Churchill's line that Italy's troubles were due to one man and one man alone. And the OWI, the Office of War Information, added, therefore, for the present at least, nothing ought to be said against the monarch, that was Vittorio Emanuele, who had so easily capitulated to Mussolini in Italy, or even against fascism. So the US was anti-Mussolini, but not anti-fascist. So therefore, once it became more evident that it was a mafia and perhaps a fascist hit, J. Edgar Hoover lost interest in the investigation, because he himself had his own mafia ties. There was a man named Frank Costello, a small-time hood, who used to pass along racing tips, horse racing tips, to Hoover, and would accompany him to the racetrack. And Hoover did not want those connections made known, as they would be, because Frank Costello was also tied in with Frank Garofalo, sorry. According if Garofalo had acted with fascist support, the likely intermediary was a man named Generoso Pope, publisher of an Italian-American newspaper called Il Progresso, and the foremost pro-Mussolini leader in the Italian-American community until his last-minute switch after Pearl Harbor in December 1941. But Garofalo, but Generoso Pope was a highly important supporter of FDR, as well as a highly important supporter of Fiorello LaGuardia, the mayor of New York. And neither of them wanted to cause trouble for Generoso Pope, which would undoubtedly have been the case if they had investigated Frank Garofalo with any seriousness. And so, in fact, an FBI informant believed that LaGuardia was one of those who essentially, down an investigation. And it's very possible that FDR was one of those as well. So after essentially allying himself with FDR, Tresca found himself the victim of fascists who were also ingratiating themselves with Washington, and of course, whom Washington much preferred. And that after his assassination, those same political elements, J. Edgar Hoover, Fiorello LaGuardia, and FDR himself, saw to it that the investigation died a morning. So I guess the lesson is that although whatever pressures Tresca felt to support the liberal bourgeoisie in 1940, it was clearly a self-defeating strategy because he himself wound up being shafted by the same liberal bourgeoisie. And I guess the implications for socialists today are clear, and that is you can't form an alliance with the same elements because these elements will essentially betray you at the first opportunity. Their anti-fascism is merely skin deep. They're eager to form an alliance when possible with the fascists, and their primary hostility remains toward the anti-fascists. So I guess that's really about it. I think that kind of winds things up. So let me know if anyone has any questions, criticism, complaints, etc.
Thank you very much indeed, Dan. What a brave man Carlo was, or was he brave, or was he just foolhardy? I wonder. But it seems to me he was an extremely brave man.
No. He was a very brave man, physically quite courageous. He went through a lot and never flinched.
Fantastic. Oh my goodness. And I'm just astonished at how dangerous it was, from both sides, from the Stalinists, from the fascists, and he was quite prepared to take them all on. He must have been such a character. I'd have loved to have met him, I think. Well, thanks very much, Dan. Have we got anybody who would like to would anyone like to ask a question or contribute to the talk? I can see I've got one hand up there. Kenneth, I'll bring you on as a panelist. Ken Syme has a question for you. He's just joining us.
Hi, Dan. Thank you very much for that talk. Can you hear me?
I hear you fine.
Okay. Yeah, I'd be interested to know how Tresca reacted to Italo Balboa's arrival in Italy after the transatlantic crossing in, I think it was August 1933. There is, of course, still a monument to Balbo in Burnside Park in Chicago, I believe, donated by Mussolini. And I've read elsewhere that even in 1940, Mussolini still featured on the cover of Newsweek. So the Americans were a little slow to fall out of love with Mussolini, I think. I'd be interested in any reflections you might have on those points. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Kenneth. Would you like to come back, Dan?
Sure. Yeah, Italo Balboa was an Italian aviator who came to the United States in 1933, a very popular figure, and many anti-fascists were not inclined to come out against him because he was seen as not primarily a political figure, even though he was sent by the fascist government clearly to cultivate support in America, among American Italians and among Americans generally. But Tresca spoke out against him very fiercely. They were, he led the charge against him. He was very isolated, but he pointed out that he was an emissary of Mussolini, and that he was being sent for one purpose and one purpose only, and that was to curry support for the fascist regime. And you're quite right. The support for Mussolini was very strong, well into the late 1930s. Mussolini was on the cover of Time magazine. Presidents praised him. He was seen as a conservative patriot, and his opponents, of course, were seen as dangerous leftists. So the presumption across the entire political establishment was that that Mussolini was a good guy, and that the people who were opposing him were cranks and dangerous subversives. And as I said, the sentiment in the Italian American community was probably 9-1 in favor of Mussolini. And it was only after Pearl Harbor and the eruption of war between Italy and the U.S., probably, by the way, one of the truly stupidest acts that Mussolini ever committed, among very many such stupid acts. It was only then that his many supporters in the U.S. did an about-face, denounced Mussolini, portrayed themselves, as super patriots, super American patriots, while not changing their ideological coloration one bit. I remember support for Mussolini peaked during the 1935-1936 invasion of Ethiopia. And Mussolini conducted that on frankly racist grounds. In New York, LaGuardia, who was anti-fascist, but LaGuardia refused to criticize Mussolini for any reason, including the invasion of Ethiopia, and New York's Black community was especially pained and outraged to see this leading Democratic Party member and an FDR supporter refused to speak out in defense of a poor, beleaguered Ethiopia, and it was poor and beleaguered. So yes, and as I said, the American supporters of Mussolini just engaged in a quick change, shed their more overt fascist proclivities, but otherwise retained the pro-fascist essence, and that frankly continues to this day.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dan. A very, very full answer. We've got Patrick. Patrick. I hope I say this name right. Patrick Sonsonga to ask a question now. Patrick, can you put your video on, Patrick?
Oh, okay.
Is that possible? You can't put your video on.
Oh,
okay.
Sorry. I'm trying.
You're trying. Okay. Ah, now we can see you. That's
Thank you. Oh, thanks, Carlo. Thanks, Dan. As a formidable leader who's been around, Dan, I just want you to qualify me here or signpost me in the right direction. There is a narrative that we shouldn't be forming alliances with fascists because of them being non-reliable. However, my argument is if we are clear with our red lines, can then we bring them along to be part of the project that probably would be dealing at the time if we felt they might be useful in whatever initiative we're engaged at that particular moment. Thanks, Dan.
Dan, would you like to
yes.
come back with an answer?
Sure. I mean, when I denounce alliances with liberals. I mean, let me make clear, I'm not talking about individuals who may be liberal in their politics. And yes, of course, you reach out to them, you try to draw them in, you try to persuade them of the importance of battling socialism, about battling fascism, and you try to get them to break with liberalism and to endorse socialism instead. But what I had in mind was the liberal bourgeoisie. That is the actual ruling class, which adopts liberalism as a kind of strategy of class domination. And I think the job of the left is to expose that element, to point out where its real sympathies lie, what its real proclivities are, and not to create illusions that the liberal bourgeoisie is in any way progressive, because I don't believe it is. I believe there's a clear class line between the bourgeoisie on one hand and the working class on the other. And the job of socialists is not to smudge that line, to make it, to make it as bright as possible. So when Tresca endorsed FDR in 1940, he essentially was painting FDR as some kind of progressive, and that wound up backfiring, because FDR and his forces essentially wound up killing Tresca and then covering up the facts of his murder. So I think it was therefore a self-defeating strategy.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dan. I hope that's answered your question, Patrick. If I may abuse my position as chair to ask a question. These days, are the Mafia still involved in union affairs in America?
Yes.
Oh dear.
The short answer is yes. There is a extensive gangsterism in American unions, and the Mafia is at the heart of it. But however, the union movement has lost a great deal of strength, and so therefore the question of Mafia penetration of organized labor is a good deal less, because there's less to penetrate. But yes, for various reasons, the American labor movement has been very vulnerable to Mafia takeovers. It's fascinating, because in Sicily, the labor unions are the foremost opponent of the Mafia. Yet in America, they have often joined forces. And I believe the reasons have to do with the structure of American politics. It's a long, complicated answer. I'd be happy to go into it, but this is probably not the right moment.
Oh, I don't know. I think that would be fascinating. Can you give us a little bit more?
Okay, well, America has a very fragmented political structure. There's no working class party. There's a two-party system composed of the Republicans and Democrats, who are bourgeois through and through. The concept of the working class opposition, there has not been a mass working class movement in a century, literally a century, and the very concept has been lost, and as a result, labor unions tend to be sort of run as feudal satraps, little gangs run by individual leaders who are very jealous of their autonomy, labor bosses. And these labor bosses are often very right-wing, and they often seek alliances with their ideological co-thinkers in the mob. So, so they at various times they hired mobsters to break the legs of scabs. They hired mobsters to threaten bosses with violence, but they also hired mobsters to threaten violence against socialists trying to to organize within the unions and turn them in a left-wing direction. So that alliance solidified over the years, and it became a major force, and it's only subsided in recent years with the subsiding of the labor movement.
Good heavens. That's my goodness, that's really, really shocking, actually. Really shocking.
It is, yeah.
It shocked me anyway. That's for sure. I think that Carol Vincent, you put a question in the question and answer. Would you like to become a panelist and to ask your question, Carol? I'm just promoting Carol to panelist if she will. Yes, here she comes. Carol's coming to ask her question. Any moment, by the magic of Zoom and the internet. Carol, can you put your video on? Could you unmute, please, Carol? You're muted. Can you please unmute? Aha, we can see you.
Yeah, here I am. Sorry about that. Yeah, it just all went a bit funny. I just wondered if there's still a Jewish mafia. I've seen some films and read a few bits about the Jewish mafia, so I wondered if there's still a Jewish mafia involved.
Do you like?
I'm sure that I'm sure there must be Jewish gangsters somewhere, but the Jewish mafia has essentially faded away as Jews have risen in the socio-economically. They're no longer poor boys from the ghettos who will do anything to make a buck, including robbing, kidnapping, etc. Who was the Meyer Lansky was the famous figure in the 1960s, who was a major figure in Havana, fled Castro, made his way to Israel, was expelled by Israel, one of the few Jews that Israel refused to take in, went back to the US and I think was put in a federal prison. But I don't think there's been any kind of comparable figure. And in any event, I mean, in recent years, we've seen Latin American drug cartels take over, and they make the mafia seem like a bunch of Girl Scouts.
Yeah, I just want to be, because pre-60s, there were these Jewish mafia mobs, and some characters I've read. So it's really it's really interesting. I wasn't sure if they've completely sort of faded and other groups have taken over, or if there's still somewhere in the background sort of doing their business. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Carol.
They've lost ground.
That's right.
To the
They don't often get mentioned. That's all.
Thanks very much, Carol. That was a really interesting question. That's why I wanted you to come on and ask it.
You're welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. I'll mute.
Right, I don't think we have anybody else with their hand up. So I think you've really given them a whole load of new information, I think, Dan. So everyone's digesting it, and probably afterwards they'll be saying, "Darn it, I wish I'd asked that question," or once they've actually had time to digest it.
Well,
but it's been absolutely fascinating. I'm aghast at how brave that man was, to take on the Stalin, take on the fascists, and just absolutely amazing. And thank you very much for coming on to tell us about him. I found it very interesting. I just want to tell everyone about the series that we're on at the moment. We're doing a series of Lives of the Left, and the next 3 series, August the 4th It'll be about Antonio Gramsci and introduced by David Broder. On August the 11th, it's all about Eleanor Marx, and that's introduced by Anne McShane. And on August 25th, John McLean, we'll be discussing John McLean, introduced by Sandy McBurney. So we've got some excellent speakers lined up for the next few weeks. So please come along and listen. The Lives of the Left. I find biography so always fascinating to know the person behind the politics as well as the politics. So thank you very much, Dan, for coming along today and giving us such an interesting talk. Thank you very much to everyone else.